The Muslim world isn't falling to bombs, invasion, or ideology. It's being turned to dust by something far older and far more relentless. The rivers are drying, the crops are withering, and the ancient heartlands of Islam are dying of thirst. From Somalia to Syria, Iran to Egypt, countries once called the cradle of civilization are running out of water. Entire lakes have vanished, megacities face riots over dry taps, farmers abandon their fields, millions are being forced to flee, not from war, but from climate collapse. This isn't just a drought, this is a slow-motion apocalypse. And in a brutal twist of irony, it's happening in the very lands where scripture once warned of plagues, famine, and divine punishment. But this time, it's not God's wrath, it's our own. In this report, we'll expose the terrifying scale of the water crisis tearing through the Islamic world, and why, unless something changes fast, this may only be the beginning of a collapse no one can stop. Let's start with a fact that should shake you. All 10 of the driest countries on Earth are Muslim-majority nations. Egypt tops the list. It averages just 18 millimeters of rainfall per year. To put that in perspective, London gets around 600, New York gets around 1,200, Egypt gets 18. Libya follows at 56 millimeters, Saudi Arabia isn't far behind, Qatar receives about 74 millimeters annually, the UAE 78, Bahrain just 83. These aren't outliers, they're the norm. Jordan, Algeria, Mauritania, Kuwait, all hovering around or below 120 millimeters a year. Entire nations home to hundreds of millions of people living on rainfall that wouldn't fill a bathtub. Now you might be thinking, these are desert countries, they've always been dry. What's changed? Everything. And it gets worse. The Middle East and North Africa region, MENA, is officially the most water-stressed region on the planet. According to the World Resources Institute, 16 of the 25 most water-stressed countries on Earth are in this region. That means these nations are consuming nearly all the water they have. Any small decline in supply, any small rise in demand, and they tip into crisis. Here's another way to understand it. MENA is home to 6% of the world's population, but it contains just 1.4% of the world's renewable fresh water. The math just doesn't work. And it's getting worse every year. Nearly 90% of children in the region live in areas of high or extremely high water stress. That's according to UNICEF. 9 out of 10 kids growing up in places where the taps could run dry at any moment. Which is exactly what's happening. Aquifers that took millennia to fill are being drained in mere decades. Rivers that once sustained empires are shrinking to trickles. The Tigris and Euphrates, the rivers of ancient Mesopotamia, the rivers mentioned in Genesis, the waters that gave birth to the first human civilizations, have lost 80% of their flow since 1975. That's not climate change. That's Turkish dams upstream choking off the water supply to Syria and Iraq. The Jordan River, where according to Christian tradition Jesus was baptized, now runs at just 10% of its historical average. You can walk across it in places. The Dead Sea, fed by Jordan, has been shrinking by over a meter per year. The shoreline has retreated dramatically, leaving behind sinkholes and abandoned resorts. And then there's Lake Urmia in Iran, once the second largest saltwater lake in the Middle East, the 6th largest saltwater lake on Earth. In 1995, it held 32 billion cubic meters of water. By late 2024, that had collapsed to around half a billion. A 95% decline. Iranian officials have admitted the lake has effectively dried up, gone in barely a generation. And here's where it gets even darker. This isn't just about nature, it's about what humans have done to themselves. Take Saudi Arabia. In the 1980s and 90s, the kingdom launched an audacious project: grow wheat in the desert, make the Arabian Peninsula self-sufficient in food. They tapped into a massive underground aquifer and started pumping. By the mid-90s, farmers were extracting 19 trillion litres a year. Saudi Arabia briefly became the world's 6th largest wheat exporter. Golden fields stretched across the desert. It was a miracle of modern engineering, or so it seemed. Because there was a catch. That aquifer wasn't renewable, it was fossil water, ancient reserves that accumulated over tens of thousands of years, during ice ages when the Arabian Peninsula was actually wet. There was no rainfall to replenish it. Once you pump it out, it's gone forever. And they drained over 80% of it in just a few decades. By 2016, the entire wheat program collapsed. The government quietly ended it. Today, Saudi Arabia imports virtually every grain of wheat it consumes. They turned water into wheat, and then they had neither. It was suicide in slow motion, and they're not alone. Iran tells a similar story, maybe even worse. Over 70% of the country's water goes to agriculture. Much of it is wasted through inefficient flood irrigation of water-thirsty crops. Cotton in the desert, rice paddies in arid zones. Decades of dam building on every river. Over 600 dams constructed since the 1979 revolution, combined with groundwater over-extraction, have left the country in what experts now call water bankruptcy. Iranian officials don't even deny it anymore. Lake Urmia is the symbol of that failure. At its peak, it was a vibrant ecosystem, home to flamingos, brine shrimp, and a thriving tourism industry. Now, it's a salt flat. In 1995, it held 32 billion cubic meters of water. By August 2025, that had plummeted to around 500 million. President Masoud Pezeshkian warned that without drastic changes, there won't be any water in dams by autumn. The dust from Urmia's exposed lakebed now travels up to 500 kilometers, spreading salt across farmland and into the lungs of 15 million people in northwestern Iran. Respiratory diseases are spiking, agricultural land is being poisoned, entire communities face displacement. And the worst part? This hadn't happened in 12,000 years. Studies show Lake Urmia has never gone completely dry in all of recorded geological history until now. And all of this is before we factor in what's coming next. Climate change is hitting this region harder than almost anywhere else on Earth. The Middle East and North Africa are warming at twice the global average rate. While the rest of the world debates climate policy, these countries are living in it. Heat records are being shattered year after year. Summer temperatures that would have been exceptional a generation ago are now routine, and the projections for the coming decades are terrifying. Climate models predict that most MENA countries will see a 10 to 40% decrease in rainfall by the end of this century. That's not a minor adjustment, that's a transformation. Spring rains, the ones farmers have depended on for a millennia, will decline the most. Meanwhile, evaporation rates are expected to increase from 47 to 54%. The math is brutal. Less water falling from the sky, and more of it vanishing before it can even be used. By 2050, water available for irrigation could drop by 13 to 28% across the Middle East. In North Africa, the decline could be 9 to 25%, and those are moderate scenarios, the optimistic ones. If global temperatures rise by 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a threshold we could hit by the mid-century, the Middle East would lose over 15% of its already scarce water. At 4 degrees warming, which is entirely possible by century's end if emissions continue unchecked, the region's water availability could collapse by 45%. Let that sink in. Nearly half of the water gone. Farming as we know it, impossible. Cities of millions, unsustainable. Research from the Max Planck Institute warns that even if we meet the Paris Agreement goals, parts of the Middle East will face unbearable heat. Days above 50 degrees Celsius, that's 122 Fahrenheit, could become routine. Not exceptional, routine. At 4 degrees of warming, some Gulf cities could see temperatures that exceed the survivability threshold for humans. This is measured by something called wet bulb temperature, a combination of heat and humidity. When wet bulb temperatures exceed 35 degrees Celsius, the human body cannot cool itself through sweating. Even in the shade with unlimited water, with fans blowing directly on you, your core temperature rises uncontrollably. You simply die. One study concluded that with just 2 degrees of warming, the supposed safe target, large parts of the Middle East and North Africa could become effectively uninhabitable. Outdoor work like farming would be perilous for months each year. Air conditioning wouldn't be a luxury, it would be a survival requirement. And who do you think won't have air conditioning when the grid fails? When the power goes out? When the state collapses? This isn't some distant science fiction scenario, it's physics, it's happening. And the timeline is measured in years and decades, not centuries. But the climate is only part of the story. The heat and drought don't kill people on their own. What kills people is what happens next, when desperate communities run out of options. Chaos. In Somalia between 2022 and 2024, an estimated 71,000 people died from drought-related causes. That's according to a joint study by UNICEF and WHO, and researchers from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. The majority of these deaths were children under 5. 71,000 people dead, not from war, from drought. The 2020-2023 drought, the worst in 4 decades, affected over 8 million Somalis. That's nearly half of the country's population. In 2023 alone, climate shocks displaced 2.9 million people. Wells dried up, livestock died by the millions. Entire villages found themselves with no water to drink, no food to eat. Families trekked for days across barren landscapes in search of humanitarian aid. Many didn't make it. Camps for displaced persons swelled with climate refugees, people who had lost everything, not to bombs, but to empty wells and failed harvests. This wasn't war, this was thirst, and Somalia is far from alone. In Syria, the link between drought and catastrophe has already been written in blood. From 2006 to 2010, Syria experienced its worst drought in the instrumental record, the worst drought in the entire Fertile Crescent in at least 900 years. Rainfall collapsed, nearly 2/3 of farms failed. Groundwater, which farmers had been pumping aggressively for years, ran out. The northeastern breadbasket region, the area that had produced 65% of Syria's wheat, was devastated. Crop yields plummeted, livestock died, rural livelihoods collapsed, and then came the migration. An estimated 1 to 1.5 million people abandoned their land and moved to cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and Homs. Entire extended families, not just young men looking for work, but grandparents, children, everyone, packed up and left. They arrived in urban peripheries already strained by population growth and the recent influx of Iraqi refugees fleeing their own war. By 2010, internally displaced people and refugees made up roughly 20% of Syria's urban population. The city swelled by over 50% in less than a decade. Food prices spiked, unemployment soared, people who have been farmers their entire lives found themselves in slums with no jobs and no prospects. And the government, it cut fuel subsidies, it ignored the crisis, it offered almost nothing to families whose lives had been destroyed. Anger reached a boiling point. When the Arab Spring sparked protests in 2011, these grievances exploded. A US National Academy of Sciences study found that human-induced climate change made Syria's drought 2 to 3 times more likely than it would have been from natural variability alone. The drought's victims became the regime's opponents. Rural frustration became urban rage, peaceful protests became civil war. And the rest is history. Over 400,000 dead, millions displaced, a nation shattered, cities reduced to rubble. But Syria was just the beginning. The pattern is repeating across the region. In Algeria in 2024, the desert town of Tyre erupted in violent riots after months of dry taps. Residents have been queuing for hours just to fill containers with water. The government promised relief. It never came. When patience ran out, frustration boiled over into the streets. Police were deployed, windows were smashed. It was a preview of what happens when a state cannot deliver the most basic necessity of life. In Iran, water protests have become almost routine. In Khuzestan province in 2021, demonstrators took to the streets shouting, "I am thirsty." They weren't protesting politics or ideology, they were protesting the fact that their wetlands had dried up. their rivers had been diverted and their taps had run dry. The government responded with force. Security services fired on crowds, people died demanding water. In Yemen, already consumed by one of the world's deadliest civil wars, the crisis is even more acute. The capital Sana'a is on track to become the first major city in the world to completely run out of water. Some estimates suggest the aquifer beneath the city could be depleted within years. Communities are already fighting over dwindling wells. Armed disputes over water have become commonplace. Water isn't just scarce in Yemen, it's becoming a weapon of war. And then there are the conflicts between nations. Water doesn't respect borders, and neither will the wars over it. Egypt depends on the Nile for over 90% of its water. Over 100 million Egyptians live along its banks. The river isn't just important to Egypt, it is Egypt. Without the Nile, there is no Egyptian civilization. But Ethiopia has built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam upstream. When it's fully operational, Ethiopia will control the flow of the Blue Nile, the main tributary that feeds Egypt. Egyptian officials have openly discussed military options. Former presidents have threatened war. The tension remains unresolved. Turkey's dams on the Euphrates have slashed water flow to Syria and Iraq by 80% since 1975. Iraqi marshlands that sustained communities for thousands of years have largely vanished. Farmers in southern Iraq watch their fields turn to dust while Turkish reservoirs fill upstream. In Central Asia, tensions are rising as glaciers retreat and rivers shrink. Upstream countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan control water that downstream Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan desperately need. Old Soviet-era agreements are fraying. New conflicts are brewing. The phrase "water wars" used to sound like science fiction, like something from a disaster movie. Not anymore. The wars are already here. They're just not being called that yet. But here's something you probably haven't heard about, something that reveals just how desperate things have become across the Muslim world. Millions are turning to the heavens. In late 2024 and into 2025, as the Middle East braced for yet another dry winter, country after country organized mass prayers for rain. This is Salat al-Istisqa, a special Islamic prayer for divine intervention during drought. It dates back to the Prophet Muhammad's time and is one of the most sacred communal rituals in Islam. Saudi Arabia's King Salman personally called for nationwide rain prayers, urging every capable person to attend mosques and beg God for relief. Across the kingdom, from Riyadh to Jeddah to the smallest desert towns, mosques filled with worshippers in early morning hours. Their voices rose together, united in a single plea: send us water. Kuwait held 125 simultaneous mosque prayers on a single day. The UAE organized mass supplications. Even Iran, where the government bears significant responsibility for the crisis through decades of mismanagement, saw officials and clerics imploring people to ask Allah for rain. In some cases, worshippers followed ancient tradition and wore their clothes inside out, symbolizing a humble plea to reverse their harsh fate. It's a gesture of complete surrender, of acknowledging that human efforts have failed. These scenes are haunting. Entire nations on their knees looking to the sky asking for water. It's a poignant cultural response, a beautiful expression of faith and community solidarity. But it also underscores a devastating truth: human solutions have failed. Critics point out that while prayer brings communities together, it doesn't refill aquifers. It doesn't stop governments from draining rivers. It doesn't reverse decades of mismanagement. When the prayers end and people look to the sky, there's an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If the clouds don't come, what then? Their answers may be the largest migration event since World War II. By 2030, the World Bank projects that average water availability in MENA will fall below 500 cubic meters per person per year, the absolute scarcity threshold. Below this level, a society cannot function normally. For comparison, the global average is around 7,000 cubic meters. Europeans and Americans use over 1,500 cubic meters per person. These countries will have less than 500. By 2050, 2/3 of countries in the region could have less than 200 cubic meters per person. That's not enough to sustain agriculture, not enough for industry, barely enough to drink. We're already seeing what happens when people can't survive where they live. Over 1 million Somalis were displaced in 2022 alone. Hundreds of thousands more followed in 2023. Syrian refugees number in the millions, scattered across Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. Climate refugees from North Africa, the Sahel, and South Asia are already making their way towards Europe, crossing the Mediterranean in rickety boats, walking through deserts, dying by the thousands. And this is just the beginning. If parts of the Islamic world become too hot or too dry to support their populations, tens of millions could be forced to flee, not in some distant future, within the lifetimes of people watching this video. Not from bombs or armies, from thirst, from heat, from the simple inability to survive where they were born. The UN projects massive displacement from the Middle East and North Africa as water becomes scarcer. Europe would face migration pressures unlike anything it's ever experienced. Not in the 2015 crisis, not after World War II, not ever. The Mediterranean would become a highway of desperation, and the consequences wouldn't stop at migration. Food prices would spike globally. The Middle East imports massive quantities of grain. When those imports become competition for survival, prices rise everywhere. Oil supplies could become unstable as Gulf states struggle with their own water crises. Desalination plants consume enormous amounts of energy, and when they fail, cities fail. Authoritarian regimes, already struggling to maintain control, could tighten their grip through violence or collapse entirely into chaos. This won't stay contained. What happens in the Islamic world won't stay in the Islamic world. This crisis will spill across every border, affect every economy, reshape global politics for generations. And here's the cruelest irony of all, the part of this story that should keep you awake at night. The civilizations that once called these lands home didn't just survive in the desert, they mastered it, they conquered it. Ancient Islamic engineers invented qanats, underground aqueducts that channeled water across hundreds of kilometers without pumps or electricity. It was genius engineering that sustained cities for millennia. Persian irrigation systems fed empires. Arab scientists wrote treaties on water management that Europeans studied for centuries. The Fertile Crescent, the very region now dying of thirst, is where humanity first learned to farm, where civilization itself was born. These weren't just desert survivors, they were water pioneers. And now their descendants are being destroyed by the very force their ancestors conquered. In the Quran, water is described as the source of all life. It is mentioned over 60 times. It's sacred, essential. Today, in the lands where those words were first recited, water has become the reason for death. The rivers that fed prophets are running dry. The lakes where pilgrims once bathed are turning to salt. The rain that scriptured promise as blessing has stopped falling. This is biblical fallout, but not the kind that anyone expected. It's not divine punishment, it's human failure. Decades of mismanagement, unsustainable agriculture, political negligence, and a changing climate we all contributed to. The question now isn't whether this collapse can be stopped. Some of it is already locked in. Aquifers won't refill, lakes won't return, heat will keep rising. The question is whether anyone will act before entire nations are emptied, before ancient cities become ghost towns, before the cradle of civilization turns to dust. Because right now, we're watching a slow motion apocalypse unfold, and the world is barely paying attention. So, here's what we want to know from you. Is the crisis getting the attention it deserves? Can anything stop the collapse? Or are we witnessing the beginning of something that will reshape the entire world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this report opened your eyes to something you hadn't seen before, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because we don't just cover what's happening, we cover what's coming next.